we're discussing Mary Warnock's work and ongoing influence in the field of embryo research and fertility treatment, because if she were still alive, she would have turned 100 at the weekend. Mary died aged 94 in March 2019. Mary became a patron of PET, Progress Educational Trust, back in 2010, and she was a great support to us. And I'd like to share with you on a few slides the letter that she wrote to me at the time. Dear Sarah, thank you for your email and your kind invitation to become a patron of PET. I'm honoured and delighted to accept. I was just delighted to get a letter on the House of Lords notepaper in the first instance. She went on to say, I have to admit that my interest in and knowledge of the world of infertility is now a bit diminished, partly because I'm out of date, but I'm deeply interested in the possibilities of therapies derived from stem cell research, as well as in the whole field of genetic therapies. So I'd be very much interested to hear more about the charity and would love to be associated with it. As you can imagine, there was great jubilation in the PET office. We were delighted to have Mary on board. And in her role as patron, Mary kindly wrote these words about PET. The remarkable ability of the Progress Educational Trust to bring together experts from medical, ethical, legal, and religious backgrounds, as well as its ability to anticipate key issues, ensures that the public and policymakers are kept up to date with ethical debate. As an independent body capable of drawing on all this expertise, PET has established itself as a provider of high quality, thorough, and objective analysis. What a absolutely lovely endorsement she gave us. And working alongside PET certainly did rekindle Mary's interest in embryo research and fertility treatment. And it also rekindled some people's interest in Mary. And after Mary left the House of Lords and did not there have a sort of an email address that was easy to guess, people often got in touch with me. And so for a while, I acted as a sort of secretary, perhaps, for Mary in relation in this sort of respect. So we'd get all sorts of requests for this, that, and the other from people. And I admit, and I told her this, I carefully vetted them before I decided whether I was going to pass it on to her. And when I did forward it to her, I'd always pass it on in extremely large font, as her eyesight was unfortunately not so great. And I just wanted to share some of the invitations that I'd sort of passed on to her. So I was delighted that she agreed to be interviewed by Roger Highfield for the Science Museum. And this is what she wrote to me about that invitation. My computer has just recovered from the worst disease it's ever had, and I am well. Thank you kindly. I would like to help Roger in any way I can and will email him direct. But Mary didn't always say yes, and I remember chuckling over a refusal which she sent me by email. I will not speak at this festival, which I've always hated in the past, and for which I am now too old to face. With very, very best wishes for 2019, Mary. I hope I've given you just the tiniest of insights to Mary as a person, just from that little bit of communication. You know, an insight into the woman behind the committee and the report, but there is so much more to say about her. But I wanted to just share these couple of light anecdotes, really, just so you can have an insight into why Mary has such a special status for us all here at PET. We're going to be learning more about her life and her work on the Committee of Inquiry into Human Fertilisation and Embryology, and her continuing influence in this field inside and outside of the House of Lords and outside the UK from our panel of speakers. But before I go to them, I'm delighted to announce that we have a special guest for you. We have Mary's son, Felix Warnock. Warnock, what am I talking about? I should like to invite him now to say a few words.
I must say that not expected to be asked to speak when I signed up to this event and was then discovered by yourself. But anyway, naturally, I'm pleased to do so. Of course, my mother, whom I think from now on I will refer to as Mary, because that's will be more recognizable for most of the listeners. She would have been pleased too that there is a legacy of the Committee of Inquiry and the 1984 report. Pleased, of course, not out of any sense of personal vanity, but that her committee did in the end manage to provide a kind of ethical pathway for the evolution of the then nascent, if I use that word in this context, infertility treatment and research community, which the 1978 birth of Louise Brown had brought so dramatically to public notice. As a professional philosopher, Mary was perhaps rather unusual in that she was exceptionally interested in outcomes, a kind of applied philosophy, I suppose, rather than purely academic and theoretical work. Indeed, she was once described as a kind of philosophical plumber to the establishment. Whenever some tricky problem arose, she could be trusted to get things flowing again. More straightforwardly, perhaps, was the view expressed by my father, Geoffrey, when interviewed by the celebrated American columnist George Will. He wrote a piece about the 1980 report for the Washington Post. And he began like this: Geoffrey Warnock, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, explains why politicians so frequently ask his wife Mary to reason about moral dilemmas. They seem to think, he says, that she knows the difference between right and wrong. The article then went on to summarize the report's reasoning and recommendations before reaching this conclusion. The Warnocks, both philosophers by training and inclination, seem to be constantly bumping into public questions that call for philosophic subtlety. Only one thing is clear: there are too many questions and not enough Warnocks to go round. Now, I don't think these words were meant as a kind of invitation to clone Mary herself. But in any case, I'm not sure that the Warnocks' 5 children, of which I'm obviously one, would have agreed with Mr. Will's conclusion. So far as we were concerned, there seemed to be sufficient of us. And as for our mother, she was, of course, completely unique. And finally, she was also an optimist, or perhaps more accurately, a positive force. And the key pillars of her report, which of course are the 14-day rule and the establishment of regulatory guidelines, which were both clear and also flexible and adaptable enough, these have achieved something which back in 1984 might have seemed nigh on impossible. They've enjoyed broad public support, and it's this really which has allowed both treatment and research to develop reasonably smoothly in the UK, in contrast with some other jurisdictions, particularly in America.
So our first speaker this evening is Duncan Wilson. Dr. Duncan Wilson is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester's Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine. And he is author of the entry on Baroness Mary Warnock in the Oxford Dictionary of a National Biography. He is also author of the books The Making of British Bioethics and Tissue Culture in Science and Society, The Public Life of a Biological Technique in 20th Century Britain.
So thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the influence Mary Warnock had on public policy regarding IVF and embryo research in the 1980s. I want to think specifically about why Mary Warnock was so influential. Of course, it's taken for read that she's influential. That's the reason we're all here today. But I thought it would be a good idea in starting this session to think about why. Now, of course, the picture you can see on the first slide here is an illustration that nicely, I think, conveys just how influential Mary Warnock was regarded as at the time. It's a cartoon from the Sunday Telegraph newspaper, published shortly after the report's recommendations were put into law in 1990. And it shows Mary Warnock holding what is supposed to be an early human embryo. Of course, those of you who are looking at the picture will see it slightly later in development. And the caption for this cartoon was "to be or not to be." So a classic existential philosophical problem, but one which was for people like Mary Warnock a very practical one. And the picture shows, I think, nicely that the fact that more than anyone in Britain, she was the person who determined the fate of laboratory human embryos. So that's just one illustration of her influence. But before we move on to thinking about why Mary Warnock was so influential, it's worth, I think, considering why she was appointed to head the government's Committee of Inquiry in 1982 in the first place. Oh, and there are several reasons for this. So as this other cartoon from the Times newspaper, I think, nicely shows, she was already, or had already, chaired a very important government committee in the mid-1970s into the provision of what we would call today special educational needs. So civil servants regarded her, and this is a quote from the Department of Health Archives, as very well qualified in dealing with very difficult moral issues as they related to public policy. Just as importantly, she was also an outsider, and that's another quote from the Department of Health. And what that meant was that she had no connection to IVF or embryology. And in fact, it's notable that none of the three other people who were candidates as chair had any connection to reproductive medicine. One was a commercial lawyer, one was an osteopath, and the other was chair of Dr. Barnardo's. And this is actually a really big shift in public policy, because before this, governments had generally picked people who were experts in the field to chair commissions of inquiry. And Warnock was the first non-expert chair, if you like, to chair a government inquiry. And that reflected the fact that from roughly kind of 1979 onwards, certainly from the election of the Conservative government in 1979, governments believed that outside scrutiny of professions like medicine was the best route to public accountability. And this is, of course, the broad kind of political and social climate that led to the emergence of bioethics in Britain. Now, Warnock tapped into this climate when she was appointed chair, and she regularly endorsed outside involvement with the ethics of science and medicine in newspapers, in magazines, and in public interviews. And she promoted this outside involvement, and in so doing kind of promoted bioethics at the same time. And this is a quote from the New Scientist magazine in 1984, one of many, in which she says that there was no reason why scientists should be responsible by themselves for solving moral dilemmas. A society in which what might be done was decided solely by those committed to the advance of knowledge would not be acceptable to those of us who are not scientists. Increasingly, and rightly she argued, people who are not experts expect to help determine what is or is not a tolerable society to live in. Now that's important because that's exactly the kind of thing that politicians were saying at the same time. So there's a link there between the promotion of bioethics and the way that politics was going. So that's one reason that Mary Warnock was very influential. But she realized she couldn't promote bioethics, or bioethics wouldn't become successful if she couldn't carry doctors and scientists with her as well. So she also promoted it as critical for science and medicine at the same time. She argued that it would safeguard them from declining public and political trust, especially in relation to things like embryo research, by helping ensure that what she called no nameless horrors were going on, hidden away in laboratories. Far from showing bioethics and her committee as an impediment to science, and especially to reproductive medicine, she argued it was vital to ensuring that we continue, as we must, to push back the frontiers of science. Now, I think there's kind of two P's that lie behind the reason that Mary Warnock was so influential. And the first of these is positioning. she very cleverly and very skillfully positioned herself and bioethics more generally as kind of a go-between, an intermediary between the public, professions, and politicians. And this, as I've already said, kind of knitted together with the changing political climate, but it also meant that she gained the support of many scientists and doctors who acknowledged that the politics was changing and that, as the Lancet says here, the era that required paternalism is past. So she kind of sold bioethics to different audiences at the same time. The second reason that she was so influential, and that, of course, that her report's recommendations were adopted in law, is that she was famously pragmatic, especially when it came to developing guidelines for embryo research. Now, very early on, after the committee's formation in 1982, in internal discussions and when they heard from expert witnesses, it became clear that there was no obvious or objective point at which you could draw the line and state, after this, research is illegal. People proposed a number of boundaries, all of which appeared equally valid. And Warnock recognized that the answer here lay in what she called the messier, less tidy business of compromise, of attempting to come up with a solution which retains as many of the benefits to society, but will nevertheless offend and horrify people as little as possible. So essentially, this is recognizing that there's no perfect or obvious answer. We have to get our hands dirty and come up with a solution that's the best solution we can. And of course, as we've already known, this is the 14-day limit, which roughly corresponds to the formation of the primitive streak in the early embryo. And Mary Warnock justified this publicly and was essential in gaining support for this, ensuring it was enshrined in law in many ways. One of which was that she very cleverly and regularly portrayed it as a scientific and a philosophical landmark. So she argued that there was no possibility of the pre-embryo and what she called the pre-embryo, rather than the embryo proper, feeling pain up to this point, as the formation, the precursors of the nervous system hadn't formed yet. At the same time, and often in the same kind of interview or source, she said it was wrong for opponents of embryo research to argue that scientists would be committed experimenting on potential individuals, because before the primitive streak, the embryo could still divide to form twins or triplets or even quadruplets. After the primitive streak, after roughly 14 days, it couldn't do this. So she often argued it was wrong to talk of the pre-embryo as a potential individual because, and here's the quote, it might still become two. The collection of cells is hardly yet one thing, nor is it several. But from the 14th day onwards, there is no doubt that Tom or Dick or Harry is developing. Now, it's worth noting that Mary Warnock trained and worked in Oxford in the 1950s and 60s, where there was an emphasis on language, the uses of language, and especially what counted as a moral proposition. And here you see the careful attentiveness to the use of words and phrases. So the pre-embryo rather than the embryo proper, a collection of cells which is hardly yet one thing, nor is it several. But after 14 days, you have Tom, Dick, or Harry. And this attentiveness to the use of language, I think, is another reason why Mary Warnock was and remains so influential. She recognized the role that words could play in framing public policy and ethics. So, despite considering herself no good, in her own words, at the subject, Mary Warnock is clearly one of our most significant 20th century philosophers. Her recommendations, as we'll see, for embryo research underpin a regulatory framework that still commands support in this country. This influence stemmed largely from her ability to reconcile competing interests and forge compromise, so positioning and pragmatism. And this led to her reputation, as Felix has already said, as a philosophical plumber to the establishment, as The Guardian called her in 2000, as someone who was happy to get their hands dirty and reconcile knotty philosophical problems as they related to public policy. This was a label that many of her peers would have been horrified by, but it was one she fully embraced. And this readiness to dive in and sort moral issues out is the main reason why she was and is so influential.
Now, next this evening is Professor Anna Mastroianni. And Anna is a professor of bioethics and law at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University. She is co-investigator of the Oral History Project, Moral Histories, Voices of the Founders of Bioethics. And she is co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Public Health Ethics. And Anna is joining us, as you might imagine, from the US.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be included in this event. I have been asked to provide my thoughts on the influence of Baroness Warnock, and I've been encouraged to call her Mary, so excuse the informality. So Mary's influence and the influence of the Warnock Committee on US bioethics and policy related to reproductive technologies. So to begin, did the Warnock report influence US bioethics and policy? Yes. But as influencers in any profession know, its influence wasn't direct or necessarily immediate. And as I prepared my remarks, I took the opportunity to chat over email and phone with several of the leaders of efforts to adopt ethics law and policy aspect of the Warnock Committee's recommendations in the US. So most of these folks are in their 80s and 90s, and these are people I know personally, and it really was a gift to reconnect. So thank you for that. So this evening, I'd like to share 3 insights. So number 1, there were many parallel efforts occurring around the same time as the Warnock report in this ethics law and policy sphere. But the Warnock report stands out for its relevance to US debates and discussions. So I reached out to Leroy Walters. So he was a professor of philosophy and research scholar at Georgetown University's Kennedy Institute of Ethics. So he had documented somewhere along the way that within 8 years of the birth of Louise Brown, there were at least 85 relevant committee reports representing governments and professional organizations of at least 25 countries with varying political structures and cultures. So these, of course, included the United States. And based on the public literature and my conversations with people of the time, among all those reports, and despite foundational work that I'll mention in a moment that had already been attempted in the US, the Warnock report became a reference point for US lawyers, philosophers, scientists, and policymakers who were at the forefront of reproductive policy debates of today. So Professor Walters is both admiring and also painfully aware of its success. He was, in fact, an architect of a 1979 US government committee report that recommended moving forward with public funding of IVF-related research subject to ethically responsible regulatory oversight. And the committee includes one of the first references that I've seen to a 14-day hard stop on culturing embryos in vitro for research. It unfortunately failed to gain traction because of the growing political power of anti-abortion activists. That said, he was able to immediately, quickly rattle off a list of 10 reasons why the Warnock report stands out. And rather than cover those, I just want to tell you that he touched on several of the points that were just raised by Duncan in his presentation. I also spoke to Professor Patricia King. She's a professor of law, or was a professor of law at Georgetown University, and she was a committee member on many relevant ethics and policy committees from the 1970s on. And she reflected on her experience as a co-chair of a 1990s panel that evaluated the possibility of federal support and ethics oversight of embryo research. So this was known as the Human Embryo Research Panel. And she confirmed that the Warnock report was a repeated presence in committee discussions. But for political reasons, you likely won't find specific references to it in their report. We can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. But notably, this was yet another US committee report in this sphere that was scuttled by abortion politics of the day. Now, Alex Capron, he was a law professor at University of Southern California. He was also a very active participant in the ethics law and policy debates, as well as these overarching committee efforts to address various aspects of advances in reproductive technologies. he added something novel in response to my inquiries. So in the 1990s, he wrote a letter. So in the 1990s, he wrote a letter to Dame Anne McLaren. And she, of course, was the developmental biologist, embryologist from the Warnock Committee. And he can't remember what prompted him to write, but he did remember exactly where those letters were. And he pulled them out of his exchange. He pulled out their exchange out of these paper files and just emailed copies to me last week. So there's some fun material in there, but Dame McLaren explains the Warnock Committee's rationale for the 14-day rule and her personal feelings on the topic. And she's deftly weaving embryology with ethics and pragmatism in a language that is accessible to a non-medical audience. And among the highlights for me was her statement, quote, "It won't worry me personally if the limit was set at 11 days or 17 days, but the later it goes, the more public concern that would be." So it was lovely. So that's insight number one. It did stand out as a reference point in US efforts, even though sometimes you would see it in the literature, but you wouldn't necessarily see it in the committee reports of the time. So number two, when the Warnock report was issued in 1984, it didn't instantly inform US policy and practice. Its direct influence is actually limited by what I'm going to call a civics course in the functionality and dysfunctionality of the American system, certainly in relation to the UK system. So the UK's political structure coalesced with significant coaching by Baroness Warnock and the other Warnock Committee members to allow the creation of this new comprehensive system of oversight that is reflected in the HFEA. But in contrast, in the US, these novel reproductive technologies had to confront an entrenched regulatory structure that just didn't permit an easy carve out for these advances. So in 1984, and even 40 years later, there is no federal national law in the US that comprehensively can address the ethics oversight of reproductive technologies for clinical use and in research. And it's a patchwork of sorts that's essential for understanding the Warnock influences, I'll call it. So I'm just going to briefly explain. So the federal government controls novel scientific advances primarily through two policy mechanisms. One's prohibition, like a federal law, which we have prohibiting reproductive cloning. And the second is explicitly linked to expenditure of public funds. So public funding of novel advances brings government oversight, restrictions, and rules. And just as importantly, the lack of public funding means no such restrictions, rules, or oversight. And as it turns out, despite the best efforts of all involved, politics and other factors conspire to effectively prohibit federal funding of research supporting reproductive technologies. And even today, Professor Walters writes to me and he wistfully says, the US failure to attend to the recommendations of his 1979 committee is a tragedy, this is quote, a tragedy that set back by many years public policy making in this arena in the US. And that extends to the much later failure of the US to oversee human embryonic stem cell research during the George W. Bush administration. So quickly, another key point is that each of the 50 states regulate and oversee medical practice, and they have the power to regulate research. And they do so in potentially 50 diverse ways. So when baby Louise was born, there already were several state laws on the books that were potentially applicable to the practice of IVF. So there were state prohibitions on fetal research and laws that regulated laboratory quality and informed consent and insurance coverage and parentage determinations and so on. So, and I have to mention that, as is so often the case, when the law is playing catch up with major advances, there were private sector efforts, notably professional self-regulation and ethics guidelines, but again, no unifying federal or national approach to novel advances in reproduction. So insight 3, and I'm going to be brief because I'm getting close to time. The Warnock Committee's recommendations and success were used as an aspirational model, but were severely constrained by growing political headwinds here in the US. So as you heard earlier, there was a moment in time, even before Louise Brown was born, where the US had the opportunity to impose regulatory and ethics oversight on novel reproductive technologies. And several committees appointed to evaluate those possibilities aspire to be what I call Warnock 2.0. But as Professor King told me, they didn't account for the relevance and political power of anti-abortion activists, the wide-ranging diversity of viewpoints in the US population. They, in her opinion, required proposals for incremental advances rather than the aspirational overhaul of entrenched regulatory obstacles. And I interpreted that as we got greedy when we saw what you could do in the UK. That said, she and I do agree that what wasn't adequately acknowledged was the uniquely deft hand of Mary Warnock, who clearly understood, among other things, the benefit of illuminating dissenting viewpoints, the framing of moral controversies, and a relentless commitment to education and participation of the public and policymakers during and after the report was issued. And then just briefly, in the short time that I have, this brief examination prompted me to reflect on my father. He was a pioneer in reproductive sciences and medicine. He was chair of the Department of OB/GYN at Penn University of Pennsylvania for over 40 years. He knew Steptoe and Edwards. I've met Edwards. I mean, I know all of these pioneers from growing up. And he and Mary Warnock were contemporaries. They were born within a year of each other, and they had much in common despite different disciplines. And for what I understand, and I think unfortunately for them both, I don't think they ever had the chance to meet. But my father appreciated the value of interdisciplinary perspectives, which is lucky for me, given that I'm a lawyer. Early on, he recognized the centrality of ethics in his work, the importance of informed consent, and like Mary Warnock, the critical importance of cultivating public trust in the work that he and his colleagues were doing. He was an educator at heart. He translated complex science to policymakers and diverse public audiences, as well as heads of state, even the Pope. I doubt he did his imitation of a sperm in those venues, which I was told by a medical student was particularly memorable. I never saw it. And it was only when he was in his early in his early 80s that he went back to the classroom as a bioethics student. So he received a master's of bioethics in 2008, a year before he died. And he went back, he said, to see if and how scholars had codified his personal philosophical questions and the ones that he raised in public, and how they responded and how he answered them. So in a word, yes, the work and tireless advocacy of Mary Warnock has had continuing influence on bioethics and policy in the United States. So thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect and honor her legacy.
Now, the next speaker this evening, following on from Anna, is Baroness Ruth Deech. Ruth is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and chair of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. She was a former chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority and of the Boyle Standards Board.
Mary Warnock, whom I got to know slightly in her later years when we overlapped in the House of Lords, was not a very pleasant woman. This may have been because for a woman to succeed in the important fields in which she moved, toughness and impervious to slights were a prerequisite, traits which in a man would be called decisiveness and firmness. Her memoirs struck me in two odd ways. One was the utter assurance that permeated them. Nothing stood in her way. She moved without hesitation or obstacle from marriage to motherhood and house owning. One paragraph ends with meeting and marrying Geoffrey. In the next, they are ensconced in a big Oxford house with children and ample household help. From don to headmistress, from philosopher to practical aid to governments, she moves. And she was a snob in the way that only Oxford denizens can be, a believer in the aristocracy of intellect and the inferiority of almost anything else. Although she described herself as a conservative, there were some nasty, almost amusingly so, comments about Margaret Thatcher in her book, pertaining largely to Mrs. Thatcher's dress code as an undergraduate and her use of makeup. Was there an element of jealousy of someone pursuing an alternative ambition? Warnock moved in three overlapping circles with great success. Oxford women philosophers. It was a golden age of striking and influential women who came at the same time to the university. Vera Brittain, Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, Elizabeth Anscombe, Barbara Castle, Shirley Williams, Jennifer Hart, all unconventional in different ways, with those traits that many men dislike in women. Mary has a claim to be the most long-lastingly influential of them all. I like to think that that is because she put her philosophy to practical use in a way that perhaps accidentally is going to affect the world for decades to come, perhaps forever. Her male philosopher contemporaries, well-known names, seem to concentrate on language and, Philistine that I am, have left no mark on the conduct of everyday affairs. Mary wrought practical philosophy and the now common acceptance of regulation of a profession by a body that included non-professionals, ironically, a practice favoured by Thatcher. By the time I overlapped with Mary in the House of Lords, it was the early 21st century. We seemed to disagree over the Diane Blood case and a scandal of missing embryos, unfortunately similar to those of recent weeks. She had a way of changing her mind, giving out opinions quite contrary to ones she'd expressed earlier in life, and her views were always influential. I have a copy of a letter I wrote to her 24 years ago, asking her not to complain that the HFEA was overstretched, which it wasn't, and not to call for yet another inquiry into the regulation of therapeutic cloning. I think by then she was not wholly up to date on all the practical issues in fertility regulation, and she did not get involved with the HFEA, unlike the great and much lamented Anne McLaren, who sat with Mary on the Warnock report, who also joined the HFEA and was the author of the authority's work on therapeutic cloning, which, following the birth of Dolly the sheep, persuaded the government that there was much to be gained from therapeutic cloning as long as human cloning was banned. Shades of Mary Shelley explained fear of cloning. From the moment of the report bearing her name in 1984 to the time of the HFEA Act, Mary's influence in Parliament was beneficial and marked. Out of Parliament, she publicised IVF in popular journalism for the benefits of the public, especially women. As she said, people wanted there to be some lines that should not be crossed in order that regulation could be seen to be working and to keep ethical order. That applied to the 14-day embryo rule, still very important, and to the power given to the HFEA to license new procedures. By creating a consensus, or at least a situation that most people could live with and understand, the ground was laid by Mary for more than 30 years of steady and uncontested widening and progress, from IVF to research, from PGD to cloning, without any public concern, or at least none sufficient to block progress. And the House of Lords has remained more liberal on this score than the Commons, because Mary planted there the notion of public benefit as a determinant in reproductive science, whereas MPs feel beholden in some cases to the more conservative of their constituents. The HFE Act 2008 had an easier passage in the Lords than in the Commons. Mary pioneered a comprehensible account of technical issues in a way that even I, without a scientific O-level to my name, could handle. She pioneered discretionary boundaries in the law, and she threw her weight behind consultation. From the moment of her report, Mary's views prevailed in the Lords. In 1988, debating her report, another equally influential figure, Lord Denning, opined that artificial insemination by a donor should be confined to stable, long married couples. How out of date that now seems. So Mary opposed in the 1980s the debates on those who, on the basis of faith, held that embryos should be protected from the moment of fertilization. And she contrasted this ban with the great good that could flow from embryo research. And she invoked the 17th century opposition to Galileo and Descartes. She explained the difference between a pre-embryo and one that had reached the stage of the primitive streak. She waved away the slippery slope fear by emphasizing the importance of statutory regulation and consent. And she quite rightly predicted that the UK model would be influential all over the world and be copied. We cannot undo the Enlightenment, she said. We cannot refuse to help people with research. That would be contrary to religion and humanity. She opposed Enoch Powell's attempt to ban all embryo research. She successfully opposed the setting up of a new National Human Bioethics Commission, which was likely to be more religiously and conservatively focused. She emphasised the rule of law and the ability of Parliament to set up select committees to look at difficult issues, those being more likely to reach consensus than individual politicians or commission members. She constantly appealed to the wisdom and legitimacy of parliamentary determination in this field. And that, of course, went down very well. She stressed the positive moral imperative on government to allow research to continue, to be funded and lightly regulated. She backed the retention of the need for a father and welfare of the child sections of the law, as I did, on the ground that they did no harm. She urged quick regulation of stem cell research and hybrid embryos and compared the UK favourably to the American prohibitions. She spoke frequently about the benefits of knowing who the sperm donor was, the changed attitude towards donors, and the difference from adoption disclosure. She repeatedly called in debate for not deceiving a child about the circumstances of its birth and how it was morally wrong to pretend parenthood. She explained that she saw no moral objection to creating embryos for research, and that the term respect for the embryo meant that it should not be used frivolously, even though, as she said, the embryo might end up being thrown down the sink. She criticised the practice of giving free IVF treatment to women who donated all their eggs. Shocking and exploitative, she called it. To sum her up, she was also perhaps the original Quango Queen and a member of the great and the good.
Following on now from Ruth, we have tonight's final speaker, Julia Chain. Julia is the current chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. And Julia is chair of trustees at SADA and trustee at the Human Dignity Trust. Previously, she was deputy chair of Norwood and of the Commission for Racial Equality, which was the precursor to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And like many people on this call, she has a background in law. She was a corporate lawyer.
We've heard a lot about Mary Warnock's legacy and the birth of the Warnock Report. And I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about how that has influenced the HFEA today and actually continues to influence it and what we're doing. So in 1984, the Warnock Report stated that, and I'm quoting, "The protection of the public, which we see as the primary objective of regulation, demands the existence of an authority independent of government, health authorities, or research institutions." And the report, as you know, then recommended the establishment of a new statutory licensing authority to regulate both research and those infertility services which it recommended should be subject to control. In 2023, the HFEA, we underwent a public bodies review. And the public bodies review concluded that, and I'm quoting again, "The HFEA plays a major role in ensuring this activity, i.e. fertility protection, and related research is conducted safely and with positive outcomes for those involved and affected by it." So there is no doubt that the HFE Act and the regulator it created, the HFEA, has been a public policy success. And that is in no small part, I think, because the Act has followed the recommendations set out in the Warnock Report and the consensus that Mary Warnock forged in 1984. Regulation was seen by Warnock as a bargain between science and society, with the HFEA embodying the key factors she set out, which are licensing, inspection, register of treatments, and guidance, information, and advice to patients, clinicians, and the wider public. The authority today comprises a mix of lay and professional members with a lay majority, including the chair, the aim of which, as per Warnock, is to ensure that decision-making is informed by expert opinion, but not dominated by it. And, as Ruth just said in her previous talk, there were regulatory lines set out by law or policy, which enabled clear decision-making and considered a range of scientific, ethical, and legal views. And some of the boundaries introduced by Warnock, as we've heard, such as the 14-day rule, mean our regulatory task is straightforward to some extent. However, it is no secret that the 1990 Act is now out of date, and I think it is probably overdue to review some of those lines and boundaries. In looking at those areas of law which now require modernisation, we're not looking to break with the original settlement set out in the Warnock report, which balanced medical and scientific developments, which was what was socially acceptable and desirable at the time. Our aim, the HFEA today, however, is to update the settlement for the needs of today. For not only has medicine and science developed at a pace that I doubt even the Warnock Commission could have foreseen, but our thinking as to what is socially acceptable and desirable has moved on. And in the next few minutes, I'd like to look at a few of those areas where change is badly needed. Firstly, Warnock's view 40 years ago, and Ruth touched on this, was that a family constituted a man and a woman preferably married. And also, she said, that same-sex couples would not have children. Today, we recognise a wide range of different family formations, and we need to ensure equality in the law and in treatment paths for all of them. Next, broadly speaking today, most of society no longer considers fertility treatment as something to be ashamed of or to have any social stigma attached to it. So, for example, a law which strictly protects confidentiality doesn't reflect reality on the ground. It even has the potential to be harmful when, for example, a patient's medical records cannot follow her as a matter of course from the fertility clinic to the maternity unit. And what about confidentiality with regard to donor conception? I've spoken a lot about the challenges of this at other PET events, but the current law that prevents a donor-conceived individual from finding their donor when they reach until they reach the age of 18, or indeed finding their donor at all if their donation was pre-2005, is undermined by the ability to easily find this information for a few pounds from DNA testing websites. Consent is another area where we need to ensure that it fits with modern thinking and reality. And many difficulties arise. So, for example, mentioning the cases which you may recall of Jennings and Wessex. So with Jennings, Mr. and Mrs. Jennings created embryos to have a much wanted baby, and Mrs. Jennings did achieve a pregnancy, but very sadly, she and her unborn child died unexpectedly during the pregnancy. Mr. Jennings then wanted to use the very last fertilized embryo they had with a surrogate, but for administrative error or whatever the reasons, Mrs. Jennings had not given consent to posthumous use. The dilemma was that everybody knew she wanted that embryo to be used and everybody accepted it would be fine, but she hadn't consented. And consent is very important in medicine and science. It's fundamental, and you can't drive a coach and horses through it by just saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter in this case. The judge actually did a great job of sort of fudging it and allowing the embryo to be used while preserving consent. But we need to make sure that that sort of situation really can't arise again. And similarly, in the Wessex case, where the donor specifically stated they wanted to be anonymous and didn't want to be contacted, even though the child born of that donation had a genetic disease, and being able to test the donor might have helped in the treatment of the child. So what do you do about that case? The case is public, and I'm not going to discuss it now, but these are the sorts of moral and ethical dilemmas that we have to, that arise time and again, and we need the new legislation, the updated legislation, to help us deal with. We also need to regulate the market as it is now, rather than it was, the fertility market. Back in the day, treatment was provided by the NHS or by a fertility clinic, which was by and large a small enterprise run by a single doctor or a small partnership of doctors. Today, over 2/3 of fertility treatment in England and Wales is provided by private clinics, which are often part of large private equity-backed groups, often with an international component. This is very different from the sector that Warnock was seeking to regulate. So we need powers at the HFEA that are appropriate to the marketplace as it is now and not as it was 30 or 40 years ago. And finally, we need to future-proof the law as far as possible. This is essential given the speed of change. Any law which is too prescriptive around scientific techniques, for example, is likely to be out of date by the time it is enacted, and we need to be ready to consider regulation of the future. We know, for example, that artificial embryo models or in vitro derived gametes are coming. When I was appointed 3 years ago, received wisdom that these things were so far in the future, we didn't need to immediately consider their effect. A few months ago, the first paper was actually published about the creation of an artificial embryo model. And so right now we need to be, and indeed we already are, starting to consider whether, when, and if so, how these new entities should be regulated. So what do I think Warnock 2.0 will look like? Well, firstly, in any future changes to the Act, the HFEA will not depart from the principles that emanate from the Warnock report. There is no doubt that many areas of public policy and public interest have changed over the last 40 years, and there have been and there will continue to be new developments in science, medicine, and society, which will require new answers. But we will always seek to regulate within the trusted regulatory framework that had its birth in the Warnock report. In a time when some laws are unworkable or not working as they were intended, Warnock showed what could be done, and this is a legacy that we will uphold. Warnock also understood the necessity for public consultation, the need to consider ethical and social boundaries as well as medical and scientific ones. And the HFEA today remains true to that legacy, as we ourselves consider difficult issues, such as whether or not to rethink the 14-day rule or approve new treatments. And we are dealing with issues that Warnock never envisaged, such as egg freezing and surrogacy. Balancing surrogacy, let me make clear, we don't deal with it yet, but the Law Commission has said that when eventually surrogacy does become regulated, it will be do so by the HFEA. Balancing the right of women, for example, to choose when to have their children, or indeed to have a longed-for family through surrogacy, with the ethical and societal considerations that these techniques invariably demand. So, Dame Susie Leather, one of my predecessors, said, perhaps the greatest achievement of the Warnock Committee is that it managed to get an ethical consensus that people understood as well as shared. And I think the HFEA today aims to continue to ensure we achieve such ethical consensus, even though some of the questions that we are considering are not those that even would have been in contemplation by the Warnock Commission. Mary Warnock was a visionary, and she was also, to some extent, of her time. We at the HFEA are following the extraordinary framework she created for us to effectively regulate the sector. But we need to update this framework so it works for our time and beyond. And I think this is something that Mary Warnock herself would have applauded. She was very far-sighted. And I hope that she would have been very proud of our efforts. Thank you.
How can the US get a public debate or dialogue going on issues like 14-day rule when everything there seems so polarized?
Oh, yes, it is. And it's so polarized mainly because of the recent Supreme Court decision in Dobbs and Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Clinic. And that was the one that no longer recognized the constitutional right to abortion. And it's really, I mean, it just seems like things are, well, I think about what happened in Florida recently. When we think about what we had happened down there is the passage of state laws, very restrictive abortion laws. And then what we saw were people in the IVF community, people in the infertility committee coming together and challenging those laws, because the way that they could be interpreted would extend to addressing infertility services or just reproductive technologies in general. And what's remarkable to me is that we have this on the clinical side, we have this incredible group of advocates who are pushing that. Now, if we're talking about the 14-day rule, if we're talking about research with embryos, I just think that's getting harder and harder. And I'm not sure what the way forward is. And that's why I was so interested in what Julia Chain was saying about how they might move forward. And are there any lessons that we can learn here in the United States? As I learned from Pat King in my conversations with her, everything that we do here has to be incremental. And right now, the 14-day rule is just too hot. It's just too hot, I think, for us to touch. So I think we're going to be looking to leadership from the UK. And
So following on from that, do you have any advice? Because we often say in the UK, we look to America, and what happens in America happens here 5-10 years later. Have you got any advice about how we could avoid following down the same path? Or do you think that because of our laws and regulatory framework, we're protected, I guess?
Well, I think there's so many lessons to take away, and a lot of them are already reflected in the Warnock report and the way that Mary Warnock proceeded. And it has to do with transparency, engaging with the public, recognizing dissent and the value of dissent, and being very pragmatic, saying we need to move forward in this area, coming up with very clear reasons why, and communicating that clearly to policymakers as well as the public in general. And what I also really appreciate is that it takes so much. It's not just working on a report, as you at the HFEA know. It's not just working on the report, but it's what happens after the report that's so important. You can do all this amazing work, like those various committees that I mentioned, but ensuring that the public is on board both during and after is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. So what I would say is keep doing what you're doing and make sure you have all those public consultations. Make sure you're bringing people along. You're taking diverse views. You're recognizing what the dissents are saying and really attending to them.
I was going to call on Duncan to see if he wanted to add anything about that one from the reflections from his work, whether he has anything to add to that one.
I don't have anything to add to what Anna's said. No, I mean, her answer is very kind of comprehensive. So I don't have anything to add to that particular question.
Okay. And Julia, as the US, you don't have like colleagues you can go to in the US, because there is no equivalent of the HFEA, and that's, we'd say, is the problem.
Yeah, no, there is none. And I think from fertility specialists and clinicians and scientists who I know in the US and who discuss, they worry about that, because it's very different from state to state. There's no consensus. There is a feeling, as Anna said, that the situation, is getting harder for people involved in fertility treatment with serious consequences. So I think we are really lucky, and we are to some extent protected. However, I completely agree that with the importance of public consultation. I think that's probably one of the things to say. And we did that, when we're looking at proposals for law reform, because if you have a public consensus, if you can get to a public consensus, or at least something that is approaching consensus, then that is really helpful when you're looking at legislative change. That's much harder, I think, in the United States today, but we don't take it for granted in the UK.
And I think we just don't have the venue. We don't have the venue to share those ideas in a respectful way.
I think that's probably true.
But it's not to say that if you move ahead in this area, that the work that's being done in the United States in the private sector will take notice and be able to move it forward. That's because the professional regulation, the professional oversight will shift, and maybe there's a way forward there, but it's going to be filtered through this very messy regulatory and oversight process, again, without any possibility in my mind of a more universal approach in the United States. And certainly not with federal funding, not in today's world.
Okay, so we'll move to the next question, which I think is really for Julia, although Duncan may have an opinion. Has the HFEA lost its regulatory ways with lots of soft inspection relationships with clinics? Should inspections now be performed independently and provide reports to HFEA licensing committees? So some sort of extra level of quango-ness, perhaps. Julia, what do you think?
No, not at all. I'm surprised by the question in a way. I think one of the things that the HFEA does very well is our inspection process, which is very rigorous. It's a very well thought out process. I think how it's changed over the last few years, which is very positive. I think when the inspection process was started many years ago, the idea was that the regulator was very much more of a policeman. I think what we've tried to do in the last 2 or 3 years is to say, well, yes, we do have a policeman function, if you like, but we also are collaborating with our clinics to make sure that we have a sufficiently good relationship that we can pick things up before they become a problem. So with the inspection regime, we very much hold the clinics to task. I think without going into detail, since COVID, we now actually have refined it. So a lot of the paperwork is done in a desk-based inspection, but our inspectors still go into the clinics on a 2-yearly basis, which they have to do to sort of sniff around, see what's going on, and they do pick things up, and they are very challenging for clinics. But also, the inspectors have a positive relationship with the idea of encouraging clinics to call before things have become a problem and, say, look, I've got this, can I do this? Can I do that? Can we go ahead with this? To try to make everything work rather than just to go in and catch people out, which is never helpful for anyone and doesn't affect a good relationship at all. So I think we are the best people to carry out inspections. I think we do it very well. As everybody will know from reading the newspapers, just a few weeks ago, we took the very unusual step of suspending the license of a clinic, which we do very rarely, but we are not afraid to use our powers. But I like to think also that we are aiming to have a relationship of trust. Somebody was talking about the importance of public trust when they spoke, that emanated from Warnock. And I think the idea of having a trust-based relationship with those you regulate is extremely important to get really good outcomes. And I like to think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've really worked hard to develop that.
Thanks, Julia. I don't know whether anyone else wants to come in. So the next question, I'm going to go to Duncan first with this one. Given the scientific developments, is there a need for another Warnock? I'm guessing they're thinking of stem cell-based embryo models, the possibility now of culturing embryos beyond 14 days, which wasn't really possible at the time of the original.
No, it wasn't. I think Julia's already spoken to that with a kind of the discussion of Warnock 2.0. There seems to be a consensus in lots of circles that there is the need for another review, and obviously we see discussion which Mary Warnock was involved with towards the end of her life about reviewing the 14-day limit. So I'm not going to sort of take a personal stance on whether I think there is the need for another body, but it seems to me that another kind of review is likely in the near future, given the pace of developments and given the groundswell of debate on issues like reviewing the 14-day limit. What I would say is if those debates happen, I would recommend that Mary Warnock's views on this are taken into consideration, because she wrote and spoke at length about the 14-day limit and the continued relevance of the 14-day limit. So even though she's no longer with us, I would urge people to read what she wrote towards the end of her life, because I think it's very important.
And Julia, you mentioned a Warnock sort of 2.0. Were you actually thinking about another committee of inquiry? Or were you thinking really of law reform?
Yes, I wasn't really thinking of a committee of inquiry, because I think that, as you know, Sarah, when we're looking at law reform, we've had public consultation, and we will be doing further work on the 14-day rule, and as I mentioned, now things like in vitro derived gametes or artificial embryo models and so on are in the foreseeable future. How and why, when, and if you regulate them, I think are questions that we need to discuss. But I think that the HFEA itself, now it has the committee structure. So we have the Scientific and Clinical Advances Advisory Committee. We have mechanisms which I think were not available when the Commission set up the HFEA, to actually have these discussions with the right people in the room, if I can put it like that, with the experts, both from science, medicine, ethics, and so on, so that we can ask the right questions, we can go to public consultation in the right way, and we can get the right advice without needing a separate commission. Because I think that within the HFEA, we have what we need to come up with some answers for these difficult questions.
Great. So I'm going to go now to some questions where people put their names on them for a change, because all the ones so far have been anonymous. So Jennifer Spears has asked, the importance of consultation has been rightly emphasised for the Warnock report. Do the panel think that the process and outcome for consultation for new legislation will be different now that many donor-conceived people and their parents and also donors have become more confident about sharing their views? And that's certainly something that we've witnessed at PET is, when I first started here, it was very difficult to get anybody to speak about these issues at all from personal experience. But now it's become, it's not always easy, but a lot easier, shall we say. So who wants to go first on that one? Shall we go to Julia first?
It's definitely become easier because I think these things like donor conception and fertility treatment in general have been, there is a language. We now have a language to talk about them, and people are much less reticent than perhaps there used to be, when there was perhaps a bit more shame attached to fertility treatment in general, or donor provision of donor sperm or eggs or embryos. And we've noticed when we do public consultations, and often we reach those groups such as donor-conceived individuals and their parents through perhaps stakeholder groups like Donor Conception Network and so on, that they are very anxious and very willing to give their views, and we're delighted because we really want to hear them. So I think we make a point of trying to reach those views in public consultation, because their voices are very important.
Alan, did you want to come in? I don't know quite what the donor scene is like in the US.
Well, I mean, I think it's just as what I was thinking is that they are well organized and willing to share, and that's part of what is going to be able to address some of those really challenging issues that are ahead of us, at least in the clinical setting. moving forward. So, and we've seen that already in the state of Florida, very activist.
And I'm going to go to one now from oh gosh, now I'm going to mangle your first name. I really apologize. Kyriaki Marangu. Do you think every country should have a legislation organization like HFEA? And if so, would it be possible to communicate between them all to make decisions on embryology? So it's supposed to have a sort of, universal, well, perhaps move towards universal agreement. So who wants to go first on that one? Go on then, Anna.
I would say that it's just not going to work in the United States, but it is an aspiration, but it's a frustrated aspiration. So what happens is that as a practical matter, it's the professional societies and the professionals working in those areas who are talking outside of the United States, learning what else is going on in the United States. But it just can't happen. It's just too entrenched now, unfortunately. So I'm just speaking from the US perspective.
Anybody else want to come on this, Julia?
Yes, I mean, look, the HFEA is, I think, to some extent, the gold standard that a lot of other countries look to, and we're very willing to share best practice and give advice, and we're often asked for advice. But I just think that the idea of a sort of overarching international body that it has international cooperation at its heart, it's just not going to work. I mean, we were talking about this the other day because somebody was asking whether you couldn't do that with sperm donors and the 10 family limit of, try to regulate it. So all through the world, sperm donors can only create 10 families. And somebody pointed out even something as uncontroversial, if you like, as sort of kidney donation or so on. It's impossible to have international regulation because each country has such different rules and regulations that I think it's very unlikely you'd be able to do it. For fertility in the fertility sector, but we're always happy to share best practice.
I was just going
to give a shameless plug because she mentioned the 10 family limit, and that is a subject of a PET event on the 22nd of May. Sorry, Anna.
No. I mean, one thing that is unique about the United States, which I alluded to, is that each state can do what they want. And we happen to have some states that are very large and very economically powerful in that regard. And one is California. And California has been able to move forward with ethics oversight of embryonic stem cell research. And they've come up with rules on whether you pay donors for research, for the eggs and so on. So there are opportunities within the states to do this sort of thing and to share and communicate, maybe even internationally, about their successes. But again, just the national correspondence, not going to happen.
Just to come in on this question, it's actually worth kind of noting that Mary Warnock, after 1990, so after the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act was passed, was asked by people in Brussels to help coordinate European guidelines for embryo research. So this is kind of the period in Europe where you have the Maastricht Treaty, ideas about a common currency, and people were thinking about, could we harmonize European law for embryo research? And it won't surprise people to realize, of course, that didn't work. It didn't work partly because lots of the Catholic countries and countries with different religious and moral contexts disagreed with some of the other countries. It also, and this will kind of resonate with some of the British people on the call, didn't work because people in Britain, certain British scientists, didn't like the idea of being rule takers from Brussels, even in the early 1990s, for something as different as embryo research. So Mary Warnock was involved with a kind of attempt for continental harmonization, if not worldwide harmonization. And that kind of story is not as well known, but is very interesting.
Yes, Anna.
So, I mean, I was just reflecting on something that Patricia King said to me the other day. And she was saying, besides her saying, she literally said this, and I have the quotes, I am a huge fan of Mary Warnock, that which is lovely. But I was just thinking about how the work in the United States, how, as I said earlier, we got greedy here. And she said, we referenced the report in our discussions, but we didn't put it in writing. And for some of the same reasons that you mentioned, Duncan, you don't want to be seen as taking someone else's national perspective. That's part of it. But she also said something to me she said, she actually used the words, it was dangerous to do that, because once you show that you're adopting a particular approach, you get all of the approach. And we just couldn't do that here. So if you even reference the Warnock report in there, you get the entire thing. So everyone on the outside, without public consultation, would think that we were on board with exactly the way the UK was doing it. So there is that dynamic that needs to be thought about.
Okay, I'm going to go into a slightly related question in a way, because this is from who's anonymous. What do you think Warnock would think of the Vatican's pronouncement that surrogacy deprives a child of its right to be created with dignity? After all, many children are conceived naturally in circumstances that are far from dignified. Not quite sure what the question I had in mind there, but I think it'd be interesting to sort of for the panel to sort of reflect on that, particularly as surrogacy is something that Mary did actually change her mind on later in life. Duncan, I wonder if you wanted to sort of comment on that first, because you might be more familiar.
Well, I mean, Mary Warnock wrote a book, I think early 2000s, late 1990s, called Honest to God, about the role or the relationship between religion and policy making. So she would have had, I think, quite strong views on the Vatican's pronouncement there, and would probably almost certainly have disagreed with it. So I mean, as far as an answer, obviously I can't say for certain what she'd have thought, but having read and have a copy of Honest to God on my shelves, I can hazard a guess.
Anybody else want to come in on that one? No. Okay. I'm going to go next to a question from Laura Bridgens, who says, such has been the extent of secrecy and lies in the lives of donor-conceived people in the UK, that nobody in authority knew the identity of any UK-born donor-conceived people could be brought before the Warnock Committee to give evidence of their experiences. Can the HFEA support public consultation about regulatory reform to consider a wider range of options in relation to the removal of anonymity that has been considered of the recent consultation? So that one, Julia.
Well, we confidentiality is, as you know, really, really tricky, particularly with the advent of DNA testing and so on. And I'm sympathetic to the fact that donors and donor conceived people and their families, there's a wide range of views about this, and we did go out to consultation. The HFEA have made recommendations in their proposals for law reform on confidentiality that really perhaps it's outdated, and that parents of donor conceived people, for example, might be able to access information when a child is actually born, rather than the child waiting until it's 18. But I suspect there will be a bit more work done on this. There are many views, and as I say, we did go out to public consultation. We have taken account of those views. Clearly, one size won't fit all, but I think the the best approach is the most transparent approach, which we have recommended, which is really that confidentiality is now outdated, and that the parents should be able to find out about their donor from the birth of a child. So from the very beginning, because we know, and I think a lot of people nowadays would tell their children that they were donor conceived, but there's a lot of evidence that children who are donor conceived have better outcomes the sooner they know that, rather than trying to hide that fact.
Okay. I don't think the panelists are going to want to come in on this, so another one for Julia. Often happens when we have the HFEA on a panel. It's an opportunity to ask them all sorts of questions, some related to the topic, some not. So Julia, this is an anonymous one. The HFEA Act is currently very gendered. This has a number of unintended implications. Would amendments include removing gendered language from the Act? And then they put in a reference which people can look at.
Right.
Because obviously, in 1980, at the time of the Warnock report, we weren't talking about gendered language in that way, in the way that this question means that. So, Julia.
Yes, and exactly. Warnock wouldn't have considered gendered language in the same way as they would not have considered, and they specifically say it somewhere in the report, we're not going to consider, for example, same-sex couples having children, because that won't happen. So we've moved on, and I think I alluded to that. We've moved on in our thinking, and I think in our proposals for law reform, what we've tried to do is make suggestions to make the Act, ensure the Act is not in any way discriminatory, and that it has a sense of equality in it. That's
Anna.
And I would say in the United States, with respect to that, there have been significant movement forward following the recognition of a fundamental right of gay people to marry. We've had significant movement at the state level to recognize, or at least reframe the laws with non-gendered language. So at least I don't know how those movements are going to go at this point, given depending on where the political structure is, but on a state-by-state basis, they've moved forward tremendously over the last however many years.
Yep. Okay. So another one for Julia. Julia pointed out that the fertility sector is more commercial now than it was at the time of the Warnock report. One of the consequences of this is to become far more difficult for UK patients to donate unused embryos for research than it was in Warnock's day, because commercial fertility sector has no incentive to make this possible under the current rules. In the pragmatic spirit of Warnock, can we please change these rules so that embryo donation becomes possible for all UK patients, because the current situation is perverse?
Well, I think at the moment, embryo donate, you can only donate unused embryos for specific research projects, and that so for example, if you are being treated, a patient is being treated in a clinic that doesn't have links, for example, with scientists doing specific projects, or hasn't partnered with somebody doing a project, then there's nowhere to donate your embryos to, because it's not that there's no specific research project. And I think one of the proposals for law reform is that allowing patients to donate their embryos more generally for medical research or scientific research, rather than to specific projects, which I think will make it much, much easier. And there will be some frameworks around that, but it will make it much easier for people to donate their embryos.
Okay, and then we have one from Anna-Louise Sussman, who says, do we have any grasp of US public opinion on human embryo research, or only of public views / polling data on abortion? So I guess that's one for Anna.
Yeah, I would have to look that up. I haven't looked it up in the last whatever, and I could probably do that on the side and get back to you. But I'd have to do some quick research myself. I know we have abortion, and it's very likely we had embryo research, certainly at the time of the discussions about the use of embryonic stem cells, which was in the early 2000s.
Okay. Gosh, there's so many different wide-ranging questions doing my head. Right, okay, we've got an anonymous attendee saying, would it still be possible for non-scientific specialists to be involved in future regulation, given the complexity of new technologies, i.e. SCBEMs, stem cell-based embryo models, which I have to say, yeah, I usually need 2 paracetamol after having worked on those for an afternoon. Duncan, I think I saw your hand up, or are you just stretching?
No, absolutely. So I've got quite strong opinions on this. I think non-expert involvement is necessary and vitally important for all sorts of reasons. I speak as a historian of bioethics and also as a historian who chairs a university ethics committee. So I think it's incredibly important that I mean, and I wrote down Julia's quote, which I think it actually gets to the heart of this, is that decision-making should be informed by expert opinion, but not led by it, for all sorts of very obvious reasons, because there are vested interests in kind of expert opinion and professional opinion. So I think that, and that is the core of what Mary Warnock argued during the committee's work, after the committee's work, and for the rest of her life. And I think we would be in a very dangerous place if at any point we moved away from that. I think outside oversight, or whatever you call it, is incredibly important and needs to be at the core of everything we do.
I completely agree and would really support that. And in fact, one of the things that we find on the authority, where, as I mentioned, we have a majority of lay members, is that, yes, some of these scientific ideas or techniques, mitochondrial donation, for example, really hard for a lay person to understand. But in order to have proper consultation on them and to properly understand the law, and for the lawmakers to properly understand the law, doctors and scientists have to be able to explain these concepts in ways that lay people can understand. And that's really, really important.
Felix, do you want to come in on this one? You're still on mute.
To comment on that that question, because really my mother would often say that, rather counterintuitively, as a philosopher, she was rather well qualified to chair these kinds of committees of inquiries, specifically because she did not have a specialist subject. The range of the sort of professional philosophical approach is about challenging expert opinions and asking tricky questions and those kinds of things without having a background necessarily in the subject matter under discussion. And that was a key thing, which I think she was very aware of her philosophical background. That gave her a kind of skill which is part of philosophical training.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And I think also it's quite pleasing to hear that for me as a non-scientist too, that that I might have something to bring to the party here in these discussions. Oh, and my colleague has just messaged me to say Winston Churchill once said on top. So I can always rely on a Churchill quote on whatever the subject.
Just to finish on that point, this is not to say that I'm sort of promoting a world of amateurism, because that's not what she was saying, that it's better to be an amateur than a specialist. It's an ability to identify the questions and clarify the issues that is helpful to the specialists themselves. I think that was her point.
Yes, and I've heard your mother on several occasions, say how pleased she was to have Anne McLaren on the committee with her, and how she sat at her feet and learned as a student so much about the science to then inform her findings on the committee. And I think that is the other thing, is if you have scientists who can explain things like Anne could in a very clear way, come at these things from different ways so that different people could understand, it really is incredibly beneficial for everyone. Okay. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to add on that point?
Just to kind of, sorry, just to follow up with something Felix was saying, of course, who is an expert and when they're an expert is kind of a fluid thing. And lots of the debates we're having, they're scientific and moral debates at the same time. They're neither one nor the other, they're both. So in many ways, Mary Warnock was an expert when it came to kind of the moral dimensions of when should we accord value to embryos, or what stage of development. And that's part of the reason she took the job, because it allowed her to engage with quite big, knotty philosophical questions. And I think we need to always keep in mind that what scientists may regard as simply a technical issue or a scientific question are often at the same time philosophical and moral questions. And that is another justification for having expert involvement, because philosophers are experts in the moral dimensions of these things.
I think, it goes back to what the Warnock Commission said, that really this was a bargain between science and society. And, science and medical research now is going at such a pace that we really, can't even foresee in 5 years' time what is being, which may be in its infancy now. And just because scientists can do things, the question is whether they should be, and that's your moral dimension. And it might be that although we can do it, we shouldn't. And that's the bargain, I think, between science and society that was underpinned the Warnock Commission. Actually, it's really, really important.
Anna.
I just wanted to say something about my experience. I've served on a lot of committees in which the work is incredibly scientifically complex. And my job, I feel like my job as even a lawyer, even though I'm an expert in certain areas, the science has to be explained to me in a way that I can apply even my expertise. So in the way that they have to explain it to me is the way that it needs to be explained to everyone. It has to be that straightforward and that simple. And there has to be that opportunity to ask questions. So I sat on the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, and I can assure you that I would sit through the scientific presentations and I would just ask a lot of questions, because you're asking me to comment on the ethics of this and the morality of moving forward in these complex gene therapies. I need to understand before I can even offer my expert opinion. And that goes for everyone. We all need to be able to understand these complex areas in the same way that when I'm teaching law, I have to non-lawyers, which I do, I have to explain all those legal concepts. And it's not easy, but that's part of that commitment. And that's part of the commitment that Mary Warnock had, my father had. My dad was on TV. He was talking to Phil Donahue, who was a big talk show host, passing around the mic. He was taking questions from the audience. It's just what you have to do if you're working in a really innovative area, if you want society to be able to come along with you, if you want to be able to do this really interesting work and be successful at it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a question that from, again, someone who's anonymous, saying, could Mary have operated effectively in the current climate of mass media and no platforming, which original thinkers are subject to now? Which I think is a really sort of interesting question, but anyway, I'll reserve my comments until the panel have commented. I'm going to go to Anna first, because she sort of smiled too much at that question, so I'm going to go there first.
I was thinking the exact same question, especially when I got those very nice letters emailed to me by Alex Capron of his private correspondence between him and Anne McLaren, which revealed a lot about her thinking about the rule, things that she'd probably said in public before, of course. I don't have a direct answer. I think it is a lot harder to do this work, but it's also, there's some real advantages if you're trying to shape the message. You do have the opportunity to shape the message, and you do have to be responsive. I don't think I'm going to have a good answer to this one. I'm sorry, but I think it's a great thought experiment.
Any thoughts from you, Duncan, on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was operating and talking in the media until fairly recently, and I think she would have been absolutely fine. She wasn't afraid to say controversial things in newspapers and in the press, and to spark a debate or to kind of back up opinions and views she had. I think she would have been absolutely fine. And I often read or read something or listen to something on the radio and kind of wish she was still around to give her opinions. I think she'd have been great.
Anna.
Well, I also wanted to reflect on something that Pat King was telling me, and she says, I really don't want to go back and revisit the history of the Human Embryo Research Report. And that was, we're talking about the 80s and so are the 90s. And even then, committee members were getting death threats. So I'm not sure does it really make a difference? I don't know.
I don't know whether Felix wants to come in on this, but I'm.
Yes, just very briefly.
I thought you may.
To really continue from what Anna just said, after the 1984, my mother had sackloads of hate mail and sort of extreme reaction from all directions, really, which she dealt with with great patience and tried to respond as best she could. It was quite difficult in those days because it was much harder. The sort of immediate communication was more difficult. The only things that she never responded to was when she got 100 letters which were identical, which obviously came from a kind of organizational lobby group, and she binned those. But otherwise, she spent a surprisingly large amount of her time trying to answer what she saw as legitimate questions. And I think she would have managed pretty well.
Yes, and she certainly still, even in her 90s, had the fire in her belly for this, because I don't think it didn't actually come off. I'm not quite sure why, but she was going to be interviewed by the Guardian or the Observer about the 14-day rule, and I think they were going to take her to the pub in Sydenham to have a nice chat with her about that and really get her opinions, I think, over a bottle of wine. So she's and as I say, it wasn't because she didn't want to do it that didn't happen. I think it's probably weather or something. But yes, I think she really was, and I think it's, we don't think, she was an influencer in a different way in the 80s from how we think about an influencer now. And I think we can't really sort of compare the two things in a way. But I don't think, from my knowledge of it, in her, and the hate mail that she was subjected to, that she would have somehow coped. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of time now, and a lot of these questions are specifically for Julia and not really on topic. So I think we will go with sort of general one. Do the panel know if any other countries have had an equivalent of the Warnock report? And I don't know whether Duncan knows about that. I certainly don't.
Oh, it's asking me to think a long way back. I spent a lot of time reading through the minutes and proceedings of the Warnock Committee so many, many years ago when I was writing the book. And I mean, there were bodies set up in Britain before the Warnock Committee. So the different colleges and professional bodies had committees of inquiry. And there were similar kind of professional, non-governmental bodies in other European countries and in Australia. Whether there was an equivalent at the time governmental body, I honestly can't remember, and I would have to kind of go and do some research and look it up. So I wouldn't like to say for certain, but there were lots of almost not ad hoc committees, but professional committees formed around the time of the Warnock Committee.
Thanks, Duncan. Okay, and I'm just, oh gosh, this so wide-ranging, these questions. It's really okay, I'm going to go with this one because it's like the dinner party question or the interview question. If Mary was with you tonight, what question would you like to ask her or say to her? So I'm going to go to you, Julia, then Anna, then Duncan, and then if Felix wants to come in, he can.
I think I'd show her our proposals for law reform and ask her what she thought of them, because that's in fact Warnock 2.0. And 40 years on, what would she say? I'm pretty certain she'd be really pleased with the work that's been done and feel it was the right approach. But I can say that safe in the knowledge that there's no one here who can ask her.
Okay, Anna.
Okay, I'm going to make it personal. I would just say, did you ever meet my dad? I mean, I know because they were running in the same circles. So for me, that would be, so it's not an intellectual question. It's more personal because I miss him.
And Duncan?
I don't know. It's a great question. It's a very difficult one. I mean, I interviewed Mary Warnock and got to ask her lots of questions. And then once my book was published, I sent her a copy and we got to know each other. We corresponded. And so I had the chance to ask her lots of questions and really valued her insight on various things. I think I'm kind of really interested in the history of philosophy, and I've been enjoying reading some of the questions about other philosophers. So I'd probably ask her something quite kind of narrow about her peers at Oxford, someone like Philippa Foot or Mary Midgley. Perhaps not relevant to today's session, but stuff I'm kind of really interested in. I should say, when I first met Mary Warnock, or before I met her, talking about mail she received, I did have to preface my email with a reassurance that this was not a scam and that it was genuine, because she was born Mary Wilson and she had a brother called Duncan. So I did try and reassure her, and she said, "I am reassured you're not my brother's ghost." So it was quite yeah.
Yeah, that is a very strange coincidence. You can, yeah, that's, gosh. Felix, I don't know whether you wanted to come in on this one or not.
Only very briefly. I think that she, towards the end of her life, I think she got rather tired of being asked questions about what her current views were. And so very often she would just respond. She was aware that 1982 to 84, the report was very much of its time. She would simply invite people to go back and read the report and not get drawn into a great amount of discussion about new issues which came up, because she knew that she probably had, her views were from that 1980s period. So she was quite a bit careful, really, about not getting drawn into answering difficult questions. But she always referred people back to the views that she did have when she'd written the report. She wanted them to read it.